Hey, thanks for tuning in to Good Authority. You might have noticed that we've fallen into a rhythm of having a guest on, followed by a monologue like we're going to do today, and then a guest on. And part of the reason why I wanted to do that is I want to be able to pull through some of what our experts are talking about and to help you make it more practical. One of my goals for this show is to really translate the advice and the insight and the expertise of the good authorities that I'm introducing you to on this show and to help you bring it down and make it really relevant in your world. So that's what we're going to do this week. And I want to talk about the topic of giving advice and how to become a master of giving advice. We've had some incredible thought leaders on the show recently talking about digital transformation, innovation, advising startups and founders, talking to kids about youth athletics and parents about raising kids who are in youth athletics, and so on. We have so many amazing advisors who have so much to share with us from their backgrounds, from their expertise. But one of the things that I've found, and I know that this to be true for myself as well as I've evolved in my career, is that just because you're an expert on the subject doesn't mean you're good at explaining how you do what you do. And I wanted to take the opportunity today to try to unpack some of what I've heard in listening to these expert advisors and to break it down for you into some approachable steps and to help you become a better advisor in your world, whatever that looks like, even if you don't get paid for your advice. And we're going to talk about that today. Whether you're a parent who gives advice or a manager or a leader, or maybe you are a consultant or a coach, doctor, lawyer, engineer, somebody who does give expert advice in your world, I think you'll find this a really interesting breakdown to understand what actually are the components of effective advice, technically, and then most importantly, what about the place from which you deliver it, which we've heard about from some of our guests is such a critical part, which we know to be true. So before we go further into breaking down advice itself, I want to make an important distinction. The distinction between giving advice and giving feedback. Now, there's a lot of overlap between those two. You could reasonably think that feedback is a form of advice, and advice maybe is a form of feedback, and that's true in many cases. But for the purposes of our conversation today, I want you to think about feedback as more the type of thing that you offer when it's unsolicited. Not always, but it's more the type of thing when you see something or you observe something that's happening with someone else or in some other situation, and you take it upon yourself to offer a perspective, offer a take. I would say that's more like feedback. Whereas we contrast that with advice, it's often you're being asked to give advice in one form or another. So when you hear me talk about giving advice over the course of this discussion today, that's what I'm talking about. Again, it's not 100-0. It's not completely different than giving feedback, but we're going to focus on how you show up to the moment when you're being asked to give advice about something. So when you hear the word advice, you probably have an association to what that means. Somebody comes to you for help and you tell them what you think. But that's not enough to really understand what's happening when it comes to asking for and giving advice. So I want to offer a 3-part framework for how to think about what actually advice is being asked and where you might be delivering it. So if you were to come to me for advice on something, there are 3 ways that I might be able to help you. So one is you might be asking me for relevant experience or practical experience on a subject. Let's say parenting, right? I have practical experience having raised 2 kids. I have practical, relevant experience, real world experience on the thing that you're asking me about. That's great. Now, should you get knee surgery? I don't know. I don't have relevant practical experience about that. So that's one kind of advice where I, as the advice giver, have relevant, practical, real-time or real-life experience that I've directly been involved with that situation, something like or exactly like what you're describing. So that's the first type of credential, you could say, as an advice giver that you have is your own experience, your relevant experience. Now, there are other domains where you might come to me advice where I have expertise, where I have knowledge, right? I went to law school. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I went to law school. So I have knowledge about the theory of law and criminal justice and constitutional law. So I have knowledge. I've been trained in that area. When it comes to organizational design and psychology, I have training from third parties, academic. I've read books. I've participated with my mind in programmatic efforts to understand a subject matter at the level of the theory, right? Whether or not I have practical experience or not, right? So if you come to me and you ask me for advice on the lawsuit that you want to start, well, I can give you theoretical advice because I went to law school and I practiced briefly, but it's been over 20 years. So I don't have relevant personal experience that's at all timely, right, to be able to advise you. So I'm not going to advise you on that terrain. I might say to you, hey, well, here's what I remember from law school, but I don't actually have any direct experience. I'm not in that practice, so I can't advise you in that domain, right? And to go back to our parenting example, while I have a lot of relevant experience to being a parent and observing other parents, I have no academic experience in parenting. If you ask me how to run a school, well, I'm not going to advise you there because my experience is limited to the domain of actual parenting, not running an institution that has to do with taking care of kids and supporting them and helping them learn. So I don't have that level of credibility when it comes to the expertise. And then there's a third type of credibility that you have, something that people may be coming to you for, whether you know it or not. So the first type of advice that we talked about was relevant experience. Have you experienced something like this that I can draw on that might be relevant to my experience? Well, I want to know about that. That's interesting. The second type of experience, do you have expertise on this subject matter that I could lean on, that I could say, hey, you know the theory, you know the practice, you've been trained in this domain. Tell me about how that training or that knowledge applies to my situation. That's your expertise. But the third that I might be really interested in is your emotional intelligence, is your ability to observe me or my situation and to use your intuition, to use your emotional awareness, to grok the situation as an outside observer, as an outside advisor that doesn't require relevant personal experience or expertise. Now, it is often the case that your advice, even if it's coming from an emotional intelligence perspective or an intuition, it is going to be informed in some way by personal relevant experience or by expertise, some kind of expertise, even if it's maybe in a related field or domain. So I don't want to make too broad a statement here that you can become a great advisor just through emotional awareness and intuition alone. You can do some of that, but it's often intermixed with your experience and your expertise. And really, the holy grail of being an advisor in any domain is that you have all three. You can meet plenty of experienced people in any domain of life. You can meet plenty of experts in any domain of life or business or anything in the world. There's plenty of people that have experience and expertise. There are very few people who have those things and emotional intelligence and their ability to intuit and understand and feel and perceive the context of a situation and to be able to advise you not just at the content level, not just what to do or what not to do, but about what it means for you and how you're showing up to the situation and how you might be getting defensive or how you might be letting your frustration get the better of you. So the first thing that I want you to do, the first practice to take these amazing pieces of thought leadership and translating into your own skill set as an advisor. Again, no matter what form of advice that takes, as a manager, as a leader, as a parent, as a friend, that I don't care about. But in some part of your life, you're being asked sometimes or a lot to offer advice. And the first thing that I want you to be able to do is to start to look at and track, you can journal on this. Well, what am I relying on to give this advice? Am I relying on my experience in this moment? Am I relying on my expertise? Or am I relying on my emotional intelligence? And if you're relying on more than one, how much? 60, 20, 20. Okay, great. And it's that noticing, the simple act of noticing is so powerful. You will start to get to know yourself better, and your advice will immediately start to get better when you start to track what percentage of your advice is coming from those three domains. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because one of the things I've noticed, especially in these recent episodes and some that are going to come in the next few weeks, is while I've tried to share with you and to kind of pull out of these conversations the expertise, the genuine, world-class expertise of these folks, I'm finding it difficult to actually ground it down and make it really practical for you in the context of those conversations, because there's so much that I want them to share with you. So I'm going to use monologues like this as a way to pull that thread a little bit deeper in just a one-to-one conversation so you and I can talk about it. And of course, I'd love your feedback on that framework as you start to think about the frames through which you tend to give advice. Are you someone who tends to give advice through experience, You're really comfortable there, or expertise, or emotional intelligence. Is there one of those where you're more comfortable? Is there one where you're less comfortable, where you can maybe gain comfort and confidence? We can work on that together in upcoming work that we might do here on the show. So that's the first part of it, is really understanding those lenses, tracking those lenses, and understanding the places where you tend to favor, right? Where are your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to those elements of credibility? And the reason why that's so important is where we're going to go next. Because even as you're working on your experience, your expertise, and your emotional intelligence, you're going to get tripped up when people come to ask you for advice. And the thing that's going to trip you up is your internal landscape, your triggers. It's going to happen to you 1,000 times. It's happened to me 1,000 times, where even though you know about a situation, you might have relevant experience. You might even have some expertise. You might even be able to sense what's going on for that other person and be able to ask them some questions, but you're blocked to do that because why? Because you're projecting your experience, your expertise, and your emotional reality onto theirs. This is what we do. This is the primary obstacle to giving great advice. It's one thing to have experience. It's another thing to have expertise. And it's a whole other thing to have emotional intelligence to be able to grok a situation and to give advice at the level of people and culture and relationships. But to know yourself well enough to be able to do that from a clean space, that's the difference between a mediocre advisor and a great one. A great advisor knows themselves well enough to know, well, I do have some experience in this domain, but it's not entirely relevant to what you're facing. I do have some expertise in this domain, but it's slightly off angle to your situation. And I can feel that there's something going on for you that's an impediment, but guess what? That's something that I struggle with too. And I might be projecting my weakness or my lack of confidence in this domain upon you. And I don't want to do that if I'm going to be the most effective that I can be as an advisor. So the work becomes an internal process. After you started to track yourself and understand where are you most credible as an advisor, as a helper, as a coach, that's a really critical sort of first order. You've got to know where are your strengths, where you're coming from. But the real work is internal. The real work is understanding where you get tripped up. Whenever I see situations with a man who behaves like that, I better watch out because those type of people remind me of my dad, and I'm going to give advice that's colored or infused with my own projection, with my own story, with my own assumptions, with my own lack of ability to empathize with a particular moment or a particular situation. So that's where the work of being a good advisor or a good helper really gets interesting. So how do you do that? So how do you start to work on yourself as a helper, as a coach, as an advisor, as a consultant? How do you do it in a clean way? And there's a couple of really important key principles that have come out of recent shows, and I want to highlight those because they're really important. They're subtle, but they're really important. One of the things that our guests have talked about is the nature of the advisory contract itself. So if I'm under contract to be an advisor or to be a helper or a consultant or an expert in some way, and my livelihood is based on continuing that relationship, I have a problem. It's not an unsolvable problem, but I have a problem. Because whether I like it or not, whether I think I'm going to do it or not, whether I imagine I'm susceptible to doing it or not, it's going to creep in. What's going to creep into my advice is, well, if I give this advice, this might compromise the length of my relationship with this person. In particular, if I'm giving edgy, uncomfortable advice, particularly advice where I might be going out on a limb and they might get defensive and they might say, oh, I don't need this advisor in my life anymore. I don't like this type of advice. And that's a risk you have to be able to take to be an effective advisor, but you can't do that if your advice is infused with your concern or your anxiety of how you're going to get paid next month or next year and the sustainability of that contract or that relationship. So it's really incumbent, if you're an advisor or a coach, you've got to get your house in order. Meaning you've got to be able to take that risk to be an effective advisor or the most effective advisor that you can be. You've got to have your business or your practice organized enough that no one client rejecting you or rejecting your advice can take you out. Because if you're in that position, if you're not diversified in terms of the people that you're helping, you've got too much risk in the equation and you're more likely to hedge. You're more likely to hold back. You're more likely to introduce caveats and bring too much softness into your advice and compromise the advice, and it's less likely to land. So that's maybe the most important thing, is to think about the relationship itself. And do you feel free in this relationship with this person to give unfiltered, raw advice that's really what you think they should do? Not that you should tell people what to do but you're really coming from a place of clarity and confidence in yourself. So that's a really critical thing that we've learned from our advisors in recent calls, and something that I have personal experience with as well. It's really important. You don't have a single point of failure in the to use an engineering term, where if one of your advisor or helping relationships goes wrong, you're sunk. It's not a good place to be. That's not a safe place to be as an advisor, and it's going to have an impact on you. So that's one of the things you really got to work on. So take an inventory. Think about the domains of your advice. So, if you're a manager and you have only one person on your team who can do a certain thing, and there's no cross-training, you don't have any succession plan in place, if this person walked out the door, either from the advice that you gave them or from something that's totally out of your control, what's your backup plan? Are you ready for that? If you're a coach or a consultant, do you have some diversity in your practice where you feel liberated and you can give your best advice to people, and not to hell with the consequences, but to know that you can be your best self in those moments, because that's what they're paying you for, right? The other thing to really think about as an advisor, and this is something that it took me many, many years to learn, is you have to know when people are ready for your advice. Whether it's advice that's coming from your experience or your expertise or your ability to emotionally or intuitively read a situation, what many people do, smart people, people who want to help, is that they come on too strong. They push too much of their experience, too much of their expertise, and too much of their read of the situation. It's really risky as an advisor, and I really want you to avoid that. Because think about what happens. You have somebody who has influence in your life. You have an advisor who you trust, and they're coming to you. There's already a preset gravitational pull to their advice, because you're coming to them because you think they know something, or you think they have some experience or some capability that you'd like to have. So there's already a tendency for that advice to carry momentum into your world, where you're going to carry that advice and maybe borrow it a little too much. We talked about borrowed authority in a previous episode. So there's a real risk there as an advisor that you push, even if it doesn't feel like pushing to you. Too much of your own authority is in the mix of your advice, just like too much of your own authority can be there in the mix of your own feedback. So you got to check yourself. You have to ask yourself, when you're being asked for advice on something, you may have incredible experience, really relevant. You may have a lot of expertise. It may be completely obvious to you what's going on in this situation, but you got to be careful, because it's not your next step, it's theirs. And if they overly take your advice but don't really understand it, if they don't digest it, if they don't integrate that advice into their own experience, well, they're going to do something harmful in one way or another. Not necessarily physically harmful, but they haven't taken ownership of that advice for themselves. This is one of the biggest problems with best practices. Everybody's out there looking for best practices on how to do this, that, and the other thing. But the best practice was the best practice for that person in their situation, based on their experience and expertise and their context. It might be entirely irrelevant for you. It might not be a best practice when it comes to your situation. So it's tempting to take that best practice because it's easier. It's more comfortable. Oh, copy, paste. They did that, I'm going to do this. Rarely works, that best practice, except with rudimentary, kind of operational tasks. But there's any complexity to it, there's so much more to it. You got to know so much more context about the situation that they're in. How does your expertise apply? What's true about the emotion of the moment? Is it really what's going on for them and the people around them? Or are you projecting? Is that coming from a past experience and you're trying to solve an old problem of yours that you haven't solved yet by solving their problem? And that's what it really boils down to. And in the end, when we talk about giving advice in any form or another, people use this phrase called the wounded healer. And it's a very, very powerful phrase. And we can see it in every domain of life where there's a helper-helpy relationship. Coaching is an obvious one. Therapy is an obvious one. Parenting is another one. Any relationship where somebody, if it's you or someone you know, has made a career or it's a central part of their identity to be the helper, you can bet, money back guarantee, that there's a little bit of wounded healer in there. I've never met anyone that doesn't have it. And the ones who say they don't, those are the scariest ones. They're the ones who have it the most, who think that they are only helping other people for their own sake, who don't think they're getting anything out of it, who have duped themselves into believing that they've worked out all their internal landscape, they've cleared all their emotional baggage, they've worked out all the authority issues from their childhood and their early experiences. Yeah, maybe not so much. So as somebody who's a helper, who's listening to this, that's where you got to focus. We talked about those lenses. Is it experience? Is it expertise? Is your ability to read a situation? All really, really powerful. And you can develop all those skills. Start by journaling, start by noticing, just the act of noticing which ones do you rely on more, which ones do you rely on less, in what situations, with which types of people. You can spend a couple months doing that. You're going to become an incredibly more powerful advisor. You'll probably 10x your advice-giving qualities just by doing that. Then we start to look at the obstacles. Second part of the inquiry, we start to look at the obstacles. Well, is this relationship structured in such a way where I really feel free to give that advice? Or am I worried financially? Then secondarily, going another level deeper, am I projecting? Am I bringing too much of myself from my own past, from my own resolved stuff to this situation? And that's where the work never ends. And that's what being an advisor is all about. That's what being a great helper, a great coach, a great therapist, that's the reward. That's not the problem. That's the reward, is that by choosing a life of service, by choosing a career where you're helping, you get to help people and you get to work on yourself at the same time. That's why it's so cool. That's why it's such a great thing to do with your life. Not out of some narcissistic need to be the person that other people rely on. That's not a healthy ego need. But hey, as a result of me being a helper of others, I'm constantly pushed back into myself to get deeper and deeper levels of awareness, deeper and deeper ways that I was holding myself back and I didn't realize, deeper and deeper ways that I was trying to hold on to control or manage other people or micromanage other people or try to avoid, difficult emotional landscape in myself. What an amazing gift. That's why being a helper is so powerful, not just for the person you're helping, but for the helper. It's why being a parent is such a ripe ground for personal growth. It's why being a leader is such a ripe ground for personal growth, because it's not only about what you're doing for other people and being a servant type leader where you're really focusing your attention on that other person that you're trying to help. It's that it's a journey of unto itself. I hope this is helpful in whatever form your advice takes. And I'd love to go deeper on this conversation. I'd love to hear from you. What's an insight that you had, maybe just in listening to the show today, a place where you realized you've been leaning too hard in a certain type of your credibility as a helper, whatever that form takes. Or maybe you just had an insight of realizing the way that you're projecting on a situation and you want to fix that. Maybe we can help you do that and get deeper into some of that internal work, because I really want you to come at the help in a really clean way. Our world needs helpers. We need a lot of them. And we really need our helpers to be coming at it from a clean space to have the most impact possible. Thanks so much for listening.